What if the person sleeping beside you for 40 years was never who they claimed to be? I'm 79 years old, and before my heart gives out, I need to tell the truth I buried deeper than any grave. My wife believes she married a quiet school teacher, a man who graded papers at night and complained about chalk dust. That story kept her safe. It kept everyone safe. But it was a lie polished over decades. I was never a teacher. I was trained to kill, ordered to disappear, and paid to erase people from history. I was recruited in the late 1950s, when the world was divided by fear and whispers. Back then, governments didn't always send soldiers. They sent men like me, ordinary on the surface, forgettable by design. I had the right face, the right patience, and a background that could be rewritten without questions. One signature changed everything. One handshake sealed my future. From that day on, my real name stopped existing. By day, I stood in classrooms, repeating lessons I barely heard. By night, I memorized roots, faces, habits. I learned how long it took for a body to stop moving. I learned how silence could be louder than gunshots. Each mission came wrapped as necessary, temporary, for the greater good. Those words are easy to accept when you're young and afraid, much harder when you're old and can't sleep. The strangest part wasn't the violence. It was the normalcy. I'd kiss my wife goodbye in the morning, knowing that by sunset, someone else's family might never see them again. I learned to split myself in two, locking the assassin away before I walked through my front door. She never noticed. That's what haunts me most, how easily evil can wear an ordinary face. There were moments I wanted to confess, moments when the weight pressed so hard my chest burned. But secrets like mine don't loosen with time. They tighten. Every birthday, every anniversary, every history lesson my students asked about events I had personally shaped from the shadows made the I lie heavier. And now, at 79, with my hands shaking and my memory fading, the truth is clawing its way out because it knows this is the last chance. Somewhere along the way, I stopped believing I was protecting anyone. I was just surviving my own choices. And that's where this story truly begins, because the first assignment wasn't the hardest one. The hardest part came after, when I realized what I could never undo. If you're still here, I need you to do something for me before I go any further, because stories like this only matter if you understand what's really underneath them. This isn't just a confession about a hidden life, a false identity, or an old man trying to empty his conscience. It's about how easily truth can be rewritten, how quietly the worst things can happen while everyone around you keeps living normally, and how a person can look ordinary while carrying a past that would destroy every relationship they ever touched. So tell me in the comments honestly, do you believe someone can live two lives for decades without slipping, or do you think the people closest to them always sense something is wrong? And if you want, type a specific word so I know you're paying attention. Comment the word teacher if you think my wife never had a clue, or assassin if you think she knew more than she ever admitted. And if you want the rest of this story, hit the like button. It tells me you want the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Subscribe too, because what comes next isn't just about what I did, it's about who ordered it, why it was buried, and the one mistake that almost exposed everything. It started quietly, the way all dangerous things do. No dramatic knock on the door, no threats, no uniforms. Just a conversation after hours, in an empty hallway that smelled of floor cleaner and chalk. A man who already knew my name sat beside me and spoke as if we were old friends. He talked about the world as it really was, not the version printed in newspapers or taught in classrooms. He talked about enemies without flags, wars without battlefields, and problems that couldn't be solved in public. I remember thinking how calm his voice was, how reasonable everything sounded. They didn't call it assassination. They called it prevention. They said history was shaped by small, invisible actions, and that certain people had to be removed quietly so larger tragedies could be avoided. I was told I had a choice, but it never felt like one. I had debts, a sick parent, a future that suddenly looked fragile. They knew exactly which strings to pull. By the end of that week, my file existed somewhere I would never see, and my life had already split into two paths. Training wasn't what you'd imagine. No shouting, no movies, no heroics. It was patience, observation, learning how to disappear in plain sight. I was taught how to blend into routines, how to look harmless, how to become forgettable. They wanted men who could walk through airports, train stations, classrooms, and never leave an impression. Violence was almost an afterthought. The real skill was control. Control over fear, control over hesitation, control over your own conscience. My first real assignment came years later, after I was married, after my cover life was solid. That timing wasn't an accident. Family made me stable, predictable, easier to trust. I was sent to a city I'd visited before on school conferences. Same hotels, same routes, same excuses. The target was introduced as a risk, a future problem, someone whose existence threatened something larger than either of us. I was told I wouldn't remember his face long. That was a lie. What they never prepared me for was how ordinary the world looks when you're about to change it forever. People buying groceries, couples arguing over nothing, children running past you while you calculate distances and exits. I remember thinking how unfair it was that everyone else was allowed to stay innocent, while I crossed a line I could never uncross. And once you do it once, something shifts. The barrier is gone. You don't become heartless. You become efficient. Decades later, I still ask myself who the real culprit was. Me, for obeying, or the system that hid behind men like me and never left fingerprints. Leave a comment with the word recruited if you believe ordinary people can be turned into weapons, or choice if you think I could have walked away. The first time is the one that rewires you. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. I still remember the exact weight of the moment, not in my hands but in my chest. They had trained me to expect adrenaline, panic, chaos. None of that came. What I felt instead was an unbearable stillness, like the world had paused to watch what I would do next. The man in front of me wasn't a monster. That was the problem. He looked like someone I might have shared a drink with, someone who had a routine, a family, a life that extended. Beyond the file I was given, they had stripped him down to a paragraph. Name, habits, vulnerabilities, a simplified version of a human being designed to make the decision easier. I followed the instructions exactly because precision was survival. No witnesses, no hesitation, no noise that couldn't be explained away. When it was over, there was no dramatic realization, no collapse to my knees, just the quiet understanding that something permanent had happened, and there was no version of my life where I walked away unchanged. What shocked me most was how fast the world corrected itself. Within minutes, people were moving again. Cars passed, lights changed. A woman laughed somewhere nearby. I stood there thinking, this is it? This is how history bends. One small act, swallowed immediately by routine. That's when I understood why men like me were useful. We didn't create ripples. We removed them before anyone noticed. That night I went home and ate dinner with my wife. I answered questions. I listened to her talk about her day. I even smiled at the right moments. The contrast was almost unbearable. I learned then that guilt doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, patiently, waiting for the years to pile up. I told myself I'd compartmentalize, that this was a necessary sacrifice, that it wouldn't follow me. But faces don't fade the way files do. Every assignment after that became easier technically and harder psychologically. Not because I felt less, but because I learned how to bury it deeper. I convinced myself I was protecting something larger, even when I stopped believing it. The real distortion wasn't the orders. It was how quickly I adapted, how naturally I learned to live with a truth no one else was allowed to know. By the time I realized how deep I was in, my family had already become the most convincing cover I could have asked for. A wife, a modest house, predictable routines, neighbors who waved, colleagues who complained about the same things every year. Nothing attracts less attention than a man who appears content and ordinary. I learned quickly that domestic life wasn't a weakness, it was camouflage. And I used it. My marriage was real. That's the part people struggle to understand. I loved my wife deeply. Every laugh, every argument, every quiet evening was genuine. But layered on top of that was a constant calculation. What could I say? What memories needed editing? Which trips needed explanations that would survive? Casual curiosity years later? Lying became less about invention and more about subtraction. You don't create new stories. You remove dangerous details until what's left sounds harmless. There were moments when the two lives almost collided. A knock on the door at the wrong hour. A phone call that went silent the moment I answered. A newspaper headline that mentioned an unidentified incident in a city I'd supposedly never visited. Each time my heart raced, not because I feared exposure for myself, but because I knew what the truth would do to her. She didn't sign up for secrets. She married a man she believed she understood. The hardest part wasn't hiding the violence. It was hiding the aftermath. Sleepless nights disguised as stress. Sudden distance blamed on work. The slow erosion of innocence in my own eyes when I looked in the mirror. She noticed changes, of course. Anyone would. But love has a way of filling gaps with generous explanations. She told herself I was tired, overworked, burdened by responsibility. I let her believe that because the alternative would have destroyed everything. I watched her trust me completely, and that trust became heavier than any weapon I ever carried. There's a specific kind of guilt that comes from being loved for a version of yourself that doesn't exist. I started to fear my own home more than any assignment. Out there, I followed rules. At home, I was improvising constantly, terrified of a single careless word. The first real crack didn't come from a mission gone wrong. It came from a moment of hesitation. By then, I had completed assignments across different cities, under different names, all carefully documented in places I would never access. I followed patterns. I trusted routines. And that's exactly why the mistake happened. Familiarity breeds carelessness, even in men trained to avoid it. I stayed a few seconds too long in a place I should have already left. I assumed the world would keep moving the way it always did. It didn't. Someone noticed something they weren't supposed to. Not the act itself, but the timing. A man who shouldn't have been there, leaving when no one else was. At first it was subtle, a lingering glance. A question asked too casually. Then it escalated. I found signs that someone was asking about me, quietly, unofficially, not law enforcement. Worse, an internal review. That's when I understood the most dangerous truth of all. In my line of work, exposure doesn't mean prison, it means elimination. For weeks I lived with a constant sense of compression, like the walls were slowly closing in. Every sound outside my house felt amplified. Every unfamiliar car became a threat. I started rehearsing explanations in my head, not for my handlers, but for my wife. What would I say if men showed up at our door? How much could I tell her without putting her in danger? Those were questions with no good answers. The irony was brutal. After years of controlled violence, it was a Small procedural error that almost ended everything. Not morality, not conscience, just timing. I was summoned for a routine debrief. That phrase still makes my stomach tighten. Inside that room, every sentence felt like a test. Every silence felt deliberate. They didn't accuse me. They never do. They observe. They measure how you breathe, how you blink, how quickly you answer. I was spared, but not forgiven. Trust, once cracked, never fully returns. After that, my assignments changed. Less frequent, more isolated, a quiet demotion disguised as experience. I knew then that my usefulness had an expiration date, and when that day came, I would not be allowed to retire peacefully. That realization aged me faster than any guilt ever did. People think guilt arrives immediately, loud and unbearable. That's not how it works. For me, guilt was slow, patient. It waited until the noise stopped. It showed up in the quiet years after the mission slowed, after the urgency faded, when there was finally space to think. Faces I was told I'd forget started returning in fragments, not in dreams at first, but in ordinary moments. Standing in line at a grocery store, watching someone tie their shoes, hearing a laugh that sounded too familiar. Memory doesn't need permission, it just walks in. I began measuring my life in absences. People who never grew old, conversations that never happened, futures I helped erase without ever knowing their full shape. The worst part wasn't wondering if I was right or wrong. It was realizing that question no longer mattered. Time doesn't negotiate. It only accumulates. And with every year, the weight pressed harder, not because I felt more remorse, but because I had fewer distractions from it. Sleep became unreliable. When I did sleep, I didn't dream of violence. I dreamed of normality. Men coming home late. Children waiting by windows. Unfinished dinners. Those images hurt more than anything I'd actually seen. They reminded me that what I took wasn't just a life, but all the invisible moments attached to it. And there's no training for that realization. No protocol. No justification that survives old age. I tried to convince myself that history would validate my actions someday, that files would be declassified, that context would soften judgment. But deep down, I knew the truth. Most of what I did would never be acknowledged, not publicly, not privately. Men like me don't become villains or heroes. We become footnotes that no one is allowed to read. That's the real punishment. Not exposure, but erasure. My wife noticed the change long before I admitted it to myself. She said I seemed distant, heavier somehow. She asked if I regretted becoming a teacher. That question nearly broke me. I nodded and said I wondered what other paths I might have taken. That was the closest I ever came to the truth. Regret is easier to discuss when you rename it. As my body slowed down, my mind sped up. Every year felt like a narrowing corridor, pushing me towards something unavoidable. I started to fear dying quietly, taking everything with me, letting the truth disappear as if it never existed. And that fear is what finally forced this confession into the open. There's a strange clarity that comes when you realize you don't have much time left. Not panic, not urgency, just honesty stripped of ambition. I'm speaking now because silence no longer protects anyone. The people who ordered things are dead, retired, or safely hidden behind institutions that outlived them. The files are sealed, destroyed, or rewritten. And I'm an old man with shaking hands and nothing left to lose except the comfort of pretending it never happened. For years I told myself that keeping quiet was the responsible choice. That truth would only cause pain. That exposing the past wouldn't undo it. And maybe that's true. But there's another truth people don't like to admit. Silence isn't neutral. Silence chooses a side. It lets distorted, Stories harden into history while real ones rot unseen. I watched documentaries about events I was connected to, listening to experts confidently explain motives, suspects, and outcomes that were completely wrong. And I said nothing. That's on me. What finally broke the barrier wasn't fear of punishment. It was the fear of dying without leaving any record that the world I helped shape was more fragile and more manipulated than people realize. Ordinary men didn't just witness history. Sometimes, we were used to quietly bend it, not out of ideology, but obedience, not out of hatred, but routine. That's the part that should unsettle you. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve understanding. What I want is awareness. The realization that extraordinary events don't always involve extraordinary people. Sometimes they involve teachers, clerks, drivers, neighbors. People who blend in so well you never question them. That's how secrets survive decades. Not through brilliance, but through normality. If there's a moral impact here, it's this. The most dangerous lies aren't the dramatic ones, they're the comfortable ones, the ones everyone benefits from believing. I lived inside one for most of my life, and it cost more than anyone will ever calculate. History will move on without my name, and maybe that's appropriate. But the truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It waits. If you made it this far, you didn't stay for entertainment. You stayed because something in this story unsettled you, because you understand that some truths don't shout, they linger. So before you leave, do 3 simple things. First, subscribe to the channel. Stories like this don't appear in headlines or history books. And if you want more confessions that feel like they were never meant to be heard, this is where they surface. Second, leave a like. It's a quiet signal that you value stories that dig beneath the surface instead of repeating what everyone already believes. And finally, leave a comment so I know you were really here until the end. Type the word confession if you believe some truths only come out when it's already too late. That single word tells me you understood what this story was really about. Now don't stop here. The next video appearing on your screen holds another secret. Another life that looked ordinary from the outside and hid something much darker underneath. Click it and keep listening.